of injecting this module? Because in our component, we are going to use a class called as which class? HTTP client class. This class is there in a module called as which module? HTTP client module. If you want to use this class, first you should import that module. First you should import this module. So after we import this module, then we will be able to use this class object. And then using that class object, we are sending the GET request to this particular URL, where when you get the response, you are going to assign that response to this array that we have created here.
So what is the meaning of that subscribe?
Now you are calling this method, get method with this data. Do we know when you will get the response? API will take some time, right? API will take some time. So when you get the response, then you want to execute this function. So basically this get method returns something called as observable. This get method returns something called as what? Observable. So to this observable, what we are doing is we are subscribing. You see, it returns what? Observable. You may have heard about something called as promise in JavaScript. In JavaScript, there is a concept called as promise, guys. What is a promise? The name itself says promise. I promise you that I execute this function when I get the response. Observable is upgraded version of promise, and there are certain differences between promise and observable, which is important for an Angular developer to understand. That is something I'll be explaining you. I'll explain you what is observable, right? So why do we use an observable and how observable is different from a promise. Basically, callback. When you get the response from the API, then you want to execute this function. You don't want to execute this function if you don't get the response. So when you get the response, then you want to execute this function. So how do we do that is, you create a function and you pass that function as a parameter to the subscribe function. So subscribe takes a function as a parameter. This is basically a function. You are passing function as a parameter to a function. And that subscribe will call this function when you get the response. Basically, you are subscribing and you will be notified when you get the response. You subscribe to YouTube videos, correct? And whenever a new video gets uploaded, you will be notified, right? Same case. Whenever a response comes from the API, this will be called. And more about that observable, all that subscribing, you will be understanding in our upcoming classes. Is this clear, guys?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Now, we are getting into the next thing. Most important thing is, you should not write such logic inside a constructor. When a constructor gets called, if any one of you know, can you tell me when a constructor gets called?
Whenever it is
An object is created. Class is instantiated.
When an object is getting created, remember, a constructor will be called when the object is getting created. Object of what? Which class? App component. Now, when the object of app component is under progress, obviously constructor will be called when the object needs to be created. So when that object is getting created, do you want to call the API? Or do you want to call the API after the object is created? Which is the right place to do? Do you want to stop this object creation and wait for the response and create the object, or you want to do this after the object is created? Ideally, after the object is created, you would like to do that. But this constructor will be called when constructor gets called when the object is getting created. Remember, in Angular, this is not the right way. You should not do this. This is a wrong way. This is a wrong way. You should never make such API calls inside where? Inside constructor. You should not do that. Then where do I write that? Our intention is after the object is created, then I want to initialize this data. Which data? Employee list. For that I may want to make some API calls. So I was mentioning that you should not do that inside a constructor. Constructor is not a right place. Then where do you write that? In Angular, we have something called as lifecycle hooks, which I'll explain you. So one of the lifecycle hook is something called as what? ngOnInit. The name itself says on initialization. Take this code out from here and place it inside. Sorry, I didn't copy it in the right way. You place it here. Now if you want to use HTTP here, what you should do? This HTTP is a parameter that you declared at what level? Constructor level. But how do I use that HTTP here? You know that if you want to use anything, you have to use something called as what? This dot. But even if you use this dot, it will not resolve the output. That means it will not resolve the problem. Why? Title, employee list, you can access that using this dot. But this HTTP, there is a difference between HTTP and employee list. Employee list is a property of your app component class. Title is a property of your app component class. That is where if you keep the cursor on title, you can see app component.title. If you keep the cursor on employee list, you can see app component.employee list. But that is not the case of HTTP. That is not the case of HTTP. That is a parameter. That is not a property of what? App component class. That is a parameter that you created at what level? This constructor level. Now, our intention is to tell that this HTTP is a parameter, but I want to make it as a property of which class? App component class, so that I can use that HTTP throughout. You have different options, guys. One option is you create maybe another variable. It's of HTTP client, and then you initialize it to null. And then what do? So here you will say this dot HTTP client is equals to HTTP. You do that. And then here instead of using HTTP, you can use something called as what? HTTP client. You could do this, right? So as you assign null, so you are getting an error, but that will go because you are doing the initialization in the constructor. That's okay. Now you have to do this.
What is the use of ngOnInit method?
Yes, I'll explain. Right, that is what I'm explaining you. Right now, I created a variable called as HTTP client. Basically, it becomes a property. When it becomes a property, I'll be able to use that property anywhere within which class? App component class, resulting I'm able to use that inside our ngOnInit. Good. But don't you think this is an additional step for us? Creating HTTP client object, the means variable, and assigning this HTTP to this, and then using that. Instead of you doing this, there is a shortcut available, guys. There is a shortcut available. This is important. I can use a keyword called as what? Private. Now keep the cursor on HTTP. See what it becomes. Is it a parameter or property now?
Property.
HTTP is a parameter or property now?
Property.
If I don't use private, it becomes parameter of this method. If I use private, it becomes property of app component class. So you can directly use that. This works. So instead of doing this additional variable creation and then initialization, you can
It's 11 o'clock.
quickly convert parameter of a method to a property. Basically, your constructor parameter is converted to a property just by adding an access specifier called as what? Just by adding an access specifier called as what, guys?
Private.
Right.
What is the advantage of doing this?
Can
Using
anyone
the
answer this?
shortcut.
Can anyone answer this? What is the benefit that we get?
So because of that, we know no need to write in the app component.
This additional code, I don't need to write. I don't need to write this additional code. This is the short form of this one. Is that clear, sir?
Yes.
Or if you want to write this, you can go ahead and write and use the same. It's up to you. Alright? Now, what is the difference between constructor and onInit? Remember, constructor is a place where you inject the dependencies. This is basically injecting the dependency. Or if you want to initialize them to some default values, like this. Here, earlier if you observe, this will give you an error, and read this. It has no initializer and it is not definitely assigned in the constructor. Constructor is a place where you do some initialization, but that is not the place to write some logic that will send some API request, get the data. Constructor is not the right place. Constructor should be used for injecting any dependencies or for doing any default initialization. That's it.
Sir,
Yes.
sir, this ngOnInit is like
Every component will have its own onInit. Here there is no concept of pages. What you have is components.
it's like page load event, like
Kind of an event
okay.
for that particular component class. There are many events, or basically we call them as life cycle hooks.
But sir, how we will come to know which point of this like
After the object is created, then it will do the initialization. After constructor, it will call this. Alright. So if you want to understand all these things,
No need of star yet. Okay.
this is a method. This is an event. Star, you will not use it for everything. Right? This is an event. Alright. So
we can put this code in a method and we can call it over here also, right?
that is what we should do. Ideally, little later I'll do. I'm taking you step by step.
Okay.
Alright. So, right. Ideally, you should do that. Now, if you go here, right click here, say inspect, and then go to sources, use Control P, and which file you should open? app.component.ts. Open that file. Alright. So here you have a constructor and you have this. Place breakpoints and load this page now. You see, first it has called. Where is the control now? You see that line is colored. That indicates that that is the control, current control point, right? So you can use F10. Now after object gets created, you see, now just here you will have run. See now where it will go after the template is also initialized. That means after things are done. Now you see it's not blocked. Basically here I am blocking it, but you see it is calling. So component constructor gets called, object gets created, and using that object it will call the initialization. It will do the initialization. Is that clear, guys?
Yes, sir.
Constructor is not a place to write such logics, sending the API request, all that. That will block the object creation of your app component, resulting loading the template, everything gets delayed. Everything gets delayed. Let me show you both practically. I'll place a breakpoint here. It's not running in a debug mode. So okay, let me stop this. I'll run this in a debug mode. And in the meantime, let's make that change as well. Now let's close this. API is still not up. That's why you will have errors here. Connection is not established because API is still not up. API is loading now. Right? So now let's go back and let's load this. Or let me close this browser. I'll open that again so that I can show you a few things. Click on this program. Alright, so now you see right click, say inspect. Now go here. This is when you do it from the constructor. But when you do it from the constructor, what is the problem? So to show you, constructor versus ngOnInit in Angular. Constructor is a TypeScript feature. As a language, you get constructor. But ngOnInit, the name itself says Angular. That is provided by Angular. And Angular knows when to call ngOnInit. Whereas constructor gets called automatically when the object is getting created. Alright. So if you observe, read this description, guys. That is created, that means that is created when a class is installed and ensures that. Read this description, guys. And read this. You should use the constructor to do what? Set the dependency injection, not more than that. It's not that you should, that will not work. It will work, but that is not the right way. You use constructor only for all the initialization or declaration. Avoid writing actual work in where? Constructor. You use it for setting up the dependency injection and initialization. Is a better place to write the actual code. So you see, loading the data from database, all that you should write it inside where, guys? ngOnInit. So that when you are building a large UI with too much of functionality, users will not face a blockage issues or performance related issues. When you are doing a thing, you can do a thing, but doing a right thing is more important, right? And a right thing here is what, guys? Placing this inside where? Means doing such initialization codes inside where, guys? ngOnInit. This is TypeScript feature and this is Angular. Angular knows when the object is created for this app component. So now let's make a call. But constructor should not be used for such purposes.
Can you repeat one more time the ng on it slightly?
You can see this.
This ng on it is like from the calling the application the starting method.
That components, not application, that components.
Okay, okay. Only individual component.
Every
Main.
component will have its own ngOnInit.
Okay.
If I have 10 components, every component will have its own ngOnInit.
Okay.
Because
So
each
that
component,
the API call to wherever we want to define for that API, the URL link is defined to that in the component level in the only ng on it method only we want to define, or else we have that ng on and some kind of methods will be there. No, so
there are different lifecycle events. You are going to, okay, basically lifecycle hooks. You will see. This is just a beginning. And
okay, so I have I have a 10 components, or the API should define to only app dot component only. I want to define in a TS file, or else I have another component, some home component, some header component like that. You know, in that also I want to mention this API.
then what do you do is you create a service
Okay.
and you inject these dependencies in the service, and those services you will inject into respective components, and in the ngOnInit of that particular component you call the service method. We will do all that. So we'll do all that as we progress. Right? I'll introduce you to the concept of services a bit later. Is this clear, guys? Any
Yes.
confusion here? Yes or no, guys?
Yes, sir.
Yes, we are good.
Yes, it's clear, Shrikant.
Alright, so then we'll take 15 minutes break. Right? Once we are back, we will continue this discussion.